Perfect. Gonna go ahead and pop out the chat over here for us. And set it to live chat. How's it going, guys? It's been a minute since we've done a YouTube stream. It's been a long minute since we've done a YouTube stream. I kind of wanted to do this instead of Twitch because this is a bit bigger than sort of the smaller things I've done before, to me. And also, just, this is one of those things where I'd rather it be recorded on YouTube only rather than both on Twitch and on YouTube. Also, let me know if my audio sounds okay. I have not streamed in a while. So, yeah. So let's sort of talk about what's going on here. I'll probably give folks another minute or two. See if anyone else decides to pop in, because I'm pretty sure there's going to be at least a few folks. If anyone does happen to drop in, do let me know. But we're going to talk about nbagile, which if you made it to my ODSC webinar, I did a very long presentation on Nbdev and sort of its future, and this was just the other day. When that gets uploaded, I believe they're going to send me the source video as well, so I'll put it on my YouTube. If not, I'll make an announcement with a link to the presentation. What I can do for you guys, though, is go ahead and give you a link to my slides. Somewhere. Here we go. This is what I want. So in the chat, I've thrown the slides for my presentation, or at least the GitHub repo for it. It was called Embracing Iterative Programming Without Compromise, Nbdev for Collaborative Projects. And one of the bits I wanted to touch on in that, and made sure I did, was about nbagile, which, if you've been following me for the last 3 or 4 months, I've hinted at it. I did a few streams on it, but hadn't really made a release. And that was due to some fairly major bugs I was facing that we managed to get through today. And so as of just a few minutes ago, nbagile version 0.0.2 was released onto pip. Now it's 0.0.2 because I did one to actually make sure that we had it secured. But you can see that as of 13 minutes ago, nbagile 0.0.2 has been released. And this is really the initial version. Might see if I can yank it and pull 0.1 and have them be the same, but probably not. So let's talk about what the heck this is as soon as I get access to my chat again, because it looks like my chat window magically vanished, but that's okay. There we go. Also, feel free to put anything down in there that you notice or have questions about with nbagile specifically. This is kind of going to be an overview of what all I've done so far, what the project's hopefully going to look like, and how to use it. So this is the documentation. It's standard Nbdev docs, with the goal of making Nbdev more agile friendly. I'll zoom in a little bit for folks here. Now, there's about 5 goals that I have for this library. One of which is to, well, all of which have a goal of taking the sort of passive software engineering that Nbdev supports and sort of the mindset behind it and make it more industrialized. So this is having it compatible with Flake 8, Black, follow proper documentation strings rather than just one-line documentation, without having to lose any of the benefit that we have from using this sort of, one-line docstring notation and everything that comes with it. And so that's this first goal here, which you can see there's an X here. This is why we're making the stream in the first place. When exporting code using documents, throw with it a NumPy documentation string format. Export and throw your tests into a PyTest compatible file format. Potentially have your documentation run on Sphinx. This I'm not sure if I'll get to first or if Jeremy gets to it with Nbdev v2. Not really competition. We kind of work cotangently and have the same goals. So if Nbdev gets there first, I'll just integrate with Nbdev. But we'll see. This is sort of what we more or less already have. So any tests are thrown into a test folder, source code into a source folder, and markdown documentation to a docs. But I wanted to make that explicit because the next part is what's going to be the most challenging. Given tests, source code, and documentation, rebuild a notebook. And so you might be thinking, well, why is that important, Zach? Why is that even needed? Reviewing notebooks in Jupyter is currently a hellscape of a task. Specifically for GitHub. There's been a few solutions, like we have NB Reader. That's nice, but it's not the cleanest. Just recently, there was an extension made for GitLab that actually was very, very well done for notebook diffs, which is great. But when I was talking with folks about what's needed for sort of Nbdev to be used in the industry, it's a way for us to not review notebooks because it takes hours and hours on end to update everything, show where exactly it's wrong. Maybe there's tiny diffs in the formatting, and so forth. So the last goal of nbagile is essentially to get rid of notebooks altogether, which I know that's kind of like, well, why would you do that? You're developing in notebooks, but it's to get rid of the review process. So you can still develop in the notebooks, just they're never thrown to GitHub if you so choose. Now that's a long-term goal. That is not what is available right now. Currently, it is just documents, which actually is a little bit more than that. So if you're not familiar with documents, it's a different way to document your code. So for example, this is a very basic addition function written in documents. So we have our parameter, its type, and then any documentation we want for the parameter, we write in this comment block and perhaps even above it as well. And I've currently used this, and it allows us to basically document our code and parameters similar to something you would see out of like, JavaScript. What currently we had before this got finished is I wrote a library called nbverbose. And what its goal is to take that parameter documentation and utilize it in Nbdev's automatically built documentation. That was step one, and we got there within a few weeks. Step two, that was a bit more complicated. What I wanted to do was take this in the notebook and output a more traditional parameter string that you would see out of libraries such as NumPy or PyTorch or Hugging Face. And so what that means is we have our inputs here. For right now, at least, they don't have the types with them because in the documentation string, we have the doc string, nicely cleaned parameters, and nicely cleaned returns. And this is automatically built for you. This works for functions, classes, decorators, anything you could possibly write where you want to do this sort of thorough documentation, you can. And what this gives you is a very fast way to take simple documentation that's quick to write and throw it into traditional that's easy for everyone else to comprehend. And that's the first functionality that nbagile currently supports. And this basically replaces nbdev build lib. The second one, which was kind of a side benefit of something I realized I could do, is people get thrown off by FastAI and basically any nbdev build libraries use of indirect imports, also known as import star. And these stem from dunder_all files, or init files and dunder_alls at the top of each Python file. And so another benefit of nbagile is that's no longer a requirement. So if you are in a situation where you don't want, say, to have like from FastAI import star, something for your library, instead you can have explicit imports like from fastai.vision.core import image data loaders, or probably PIL image would be a better example of that. And all you have to do is add it to your nbdev settings.ini. It's a parameter you can do. It's called useAll. You can just set it to false. That's from a top perspective, everything that nbagile has so far. But to me, that's a big enough marker that I wanted to make this release, because I'm honestly, personally going to be using this everywhere I can, because cleaner code is always good. And this is thrown into everything but the notebooks, which is even better. So let's sort of walk through it a little bit. So this is, our GitHub repo, right? It's built from the nbdev template. And let's go take a peek at docstring. Now this might change, might not. I started writing this out as docstring because at first I had the goal of simply changing the NumPy docstrings. And it turned into much more than I thought it would, which I wouldn't say is a bad thing. It's more so unintended benefits. So, and I'm just going through the documentation. You can straight up pull up the docs and follow along with me if you want. I'll go ahead and link to this documentation in the chat for you all. But, as we see here, the goal of this module is to take code that looks like this and convert it into something pretty like this. And I'm not going to explain, what this source code is doing necessarily. The main reason why I'm talking about this specifically is if you want to go through and look under the hood, everything that this library is built upon runs on abstract syntax trees, which is something I never knew that I would have to learn. I didn't even know what they really were before this. They just seemed like some giant scary thing. It's actually a really cool Python parser that allows us to basically perform this madness. So let's skip from the notebook, go to the docs. It's a little cleaner and you don't have to look at scary source code. So the first bit we have is we need basically a way for us to take our docstring and get the type annotations from it. So that's what this basically does. This is FastAI's apply, which is something I found I generally like to use a lot. It lets us recursively apply functions on some object, which wound up being very helpful for us. But now let's go to the meat and potatoes. So first we have, if we look at a functional level rather than at an API level, this function called, read. Reformat Function. And it does kind of what you think of it. So it takes some source code representation of code, a string representation of some code, sorry, and converts it using documents into something that's more akin to PEP8. So here we have an example of delegates being used, which is a fast core decorator. Then we have our addition function. Now the delegates, for the record, for those of you who actually know what delegates is, it's very confusing that that's here, and that's okay. That's not the point. The point is to show that decorators can be used. But we can see that we have some document annotations. So we have A with some types, B with some documentation, and our function, which conveniently has a function inside a function. And if we do reformat function, it keeps our original function innards, but then gives us that nice, pretty formatted doc string. So that way anyone who's traversing your source code doesn't have to feel weirded out by the navigation. Everything's segmented separately. And it's done just automatically for you. And it should cover, and I can pretty much confidently say 99% of edge cases. I did thorough testing with everything I could possibly throw at this to make sure it was as stable as possible. The only thing I haven't been able to quite figure out if it is still there or not is if you put comments in your code. And this is because we basically rebuild it from those trees, so I'm fairly certain that information probably gets lost. I'll check that, verify it, open up a bug if so, and that'll come in the next version. But just the fact that we're able to go from this into this, in my opinion, is something extremely important and valuable. Now, of course, we have a class, or we have a function, but then what about classes? And we have a level for that too, called Reformat Class. Now, Reformat Class is a little differently, or made a little different than Reformat Function. It has something called a recursion level. Now, basically, if you have nested classes, you can basically go through and find all of them recursively and basically rebuild them out. And so this is how we sort of solve the problem of, well, what happens if I have nested classes and nested functions with nested classes? For the most part, it'll automatically figure this out for you. You usually don't have more than a class and a class, though, so that's why the recursion is set to 1 by default. But we can see here we have an example class, arithmetic, which might be spelled wrong. No, I spelled it right for once. And, it has some functions in it, right? We have class arithmetic, some private variables stored, a doc string. It's a very basic class. Actually, that's the reformatted one. There we go. Some messy code, inner classes, inner functions, and so forth. And what we're able to do is obviously prettify that up, make it more NumPy styled. And if you notice, we also mildly cleaned up the code a little bit. And so what winds up happening is, since we basically, how this whole thing works is we compile the code using, that's what the AST module is for. And then using an unparser, we take that compiled and parsed code and spit out the original code. And since it's already all there, everything is compiled how Python reads it. And we make it interpretable for us. And so that's why anything that's unnecessary is no longer there. Like that random white space between -O, -B, and -C. And so, we essentially fake having black as a code formatter. I'm pretty sure we have another example here of where I have, say, a fastDI import statement, a NumPy import statement, and arithmetic and some functions and some constants. I'll go ahead and run this down here because I don't think I ran it for the actual documentation, sadly. But that's okay. Let's go down to where that is. So let's go ahead and run all these cells. And I think I actually know why. Let's keep this in mind for right now, okay? And we'll call this multiple funcs a file. So we have transforming our functions, right? And we have transforming our classes. There's a manual process for doing that, but that's not very helpful from an API perspective, right? You want to automatically be able to do it. And so we have basically clean file as a way to do so. So clean file takes in a Python file generated from Nbdev and throws in our essentially black formatted plus NumPy formatted doc strings in code. And use all is a boolean for having you to basically enable or disable having Nbdev build this dunder all for you. Now, and finally, of course, from an actual user perspective, we have those Nbdev commands, like I mentioned earlier. So we have nbagile build lib, nbagile build docs, and nbagile diff notebooks. These mimic nbdev build lib, nbdev build docs, and nbdev diff notebooks. So if you want to do this and utilize this for your nbdev build library, these are the commands you use instead to take your notebook and reformat its outputs. Now, let's talk about this multiple funcs then, right? So if we have this multiple funcs here, and I went ahead and threw this into, say, I'm just going to make a very simplistic file here, and we'll call this testing.py. Go back into our doc string, grab all this, and throw it in here. Right, so we have our Python file as it stands. And what I can now do is say clean file testing.py, and we'll say use all equals false. Now, if I check in here, refresh it, it automatically converted our code for us for just one file. And so what this allows is if you just want the ability to clean your files up from documents, not even necessarily using the entire nbagile framework, just this one capability, just simply do from nbagile doc string import clean file. You can specify whether you want it to have it under all. So for example, I'll go back to our old one, and then you just clean up the file. It doesn't show me the dunder all because we originally didn't have the dunder. That's why that's not there. But that's all you need to use this library. And so now if I wanted to, say, build our entire nbdev library, we do nbagile build lib, and it'll go ahead and convert everything for us, just like you would with nbdev. Whether or not you should use this for, like, say, industrialized projects or small projects, personally, I think you should always use this. Now, part of that is my own bias, but folks will look at your code when investigating your framework, and typically most machine learning engineers have some software engineering background, for the most part. And so they'll be looking for code that looks like this, that will impress them, rather than code that has the documents annotation or one-line doc strings. It's harder to read in that way. And so personally, from here on out, I'm always going to be using nbagile. If we go over to open issues, there's basically two. This one is a mild bug with the library right now when it comes to documentation. Don't necessarily have to worry about that one as much. The other one is switching to nbprocess. So nbprocess is Jeremy Howard's new library that's going to be replacing nbdev. It's the nbdev v2. And so I'm going to make sure that nbagile can support that. It's going to be a slow process. I'll probably get further with nbagile before I do that and take a look at it, but that is on the long-term plans. And the other thing I'll make note of is currently there is not Python 3.10 support. I mentioned earlier that we use abstract syntax trees to basically perform everything. And how that works slightly changed in Python 3.10. And so I need to go look at how to support that, which I might get to in the next few months. We'll see. I got to see how much time I have on my hands. But that, as a whole, is the current state of nbagile. Basically, next on my list is to take any tests that we have in our notebooks and have the ability to throw them into PyTest compatible files. This way, if someone just wants to review the tests, which happens quite often, they can very quickly, rather than having to peruse through a giant notebook. And then if they want to go play with the code in the notebook, they still have that opportunity. But that, as a whole, is nbagile and where it stands. Chat wasn't really too proactive during this stream, but that's okay. If you do have any questions over nbagile, I'm just very quickly pulling up my Twitter profile for you guys. You can find me here. Feel free to DM me over this or at me and ask any questions you have. If you run into any bugs, definitely open up an issue here when it specifically comes to just the notebook format or the source code formatting, since obviously that's the only thing we really support right now. But otherwise, if there aren't any questions at the last minute that folks want to throw at me, I'll go ahead and sort of end the stream. I know this was very short. If folks want me to do more demos with nbagile specifically, let me know. It's pretty much just plug and play with nbdev. You don't even need to really change anything. And that's the goal. So yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks for joining.